Hey everyone, Tactics here with episode 2 of my Midnight Tank discussion, where in this video we're going to be covering all the changes coming to Vengeance Demon Hunter in the new expansion, which may be the tank spec with the most overall changes, including significant shakeups to both the class and spec tree, several impactful baseline adjustments, and an entirely new hero tree in Annihilator, which is replacing Felskard and is shared with the new Devourer spec. On top of these changes, I'll also be discussing the Season 1 tier bonus, as well as how the spec actually feels and where I think it stacks up currently after doing a bunch of testing in Mythic Plus. As I mentioned, this is episode 2 of the series where I've already discussed Blood Death Knight, and I'll be going through the remaining 4 tank specs over the next couple weeks. So if that sounds interesting to you, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Otherwise, let's kick things off with the plethora of baseline changes coming to Vengeance, which I'll try and rapid fire through here. First up, let's talk generators. Fracture is now baseline with shear being removed entirely, and it's also gotten a bump up in terms of damage and the cooldown. Fellblade, on the other hand, has received a fairly substantial nerf, with the Fury generation going down from 40 all the way to 15. For spenders, Spirit Bomb has been entirely reworked from being your uncapped AoE ability to a 25-second cooldown big AoE hit to kind of differentiate it a bit more from Soul Cleave and give it its own identity, which I am a fan of. Speaking of Soul Cleave, to fill that missing gap of an uncapped AoE ability, Soul Cleave now hits everything in front of you, just doing reduced damage beyond 5 targets instead of not hitting anything beyond 5 targets, meaning in big pulls, it's going to help a lot with your aggro situation. The souls spent here also further increase its damage done instead of scaling the healing, so a bit less sustain, but a bit more damage. When it comes to mitigation, there are some pretty significant buffs to talk about. First off, demon spikes have had both the deflecting and extended spikes talent baked in and then some, with the base duration increasing from 8 seconds all the way up to 12 seconds and it gaining 8% parry. You are losing the second charge baseline, but you do get that back pretty easily from a class tree talent. Speaking of class tree talents, Meta is having the cooldown reduction baked in as well, so just baseline is a 2-minute CD. Last up is a big quality of life change to Fiery Brand, where the damage reduction portion of the effect is now tied to your character rather than the debuff, meaning you will immediately gain the durability benefits against all targets when you press the button, and the spreading effect is only for additional damage. These changes are all part of Blizzard's main goal for Vengeance going into Midnight, which is boosting up the baseline durability and reducing the ramp-up time it actually takes to feel tanky, so essentially raising the skill floor but reducing the ceiling. Now, of course, to accomplish that, it's not all going to be buffs, but the main nerfs are coming in the spec tree, so we'll discuss that later. Instead, let's move on to the class tree. The first 2/3 of this are fairly similar. I think Fellblade and Blazing Path have swapped places, but otherwise the big change here is that Demonic is gone, which means you will no longer be gaining any meta uptime when you use Felldev. Now, they have upped the damage and significantly boosted the healing in order to compensate partially for that, but there is still certainly much less defensive value tied to this ability now, though it is still very strong when it comes to overall damage or generating threat. We're also going to see later on, thanks to the Apex talent, kind of similar to Blood Death Knight, Vengeance is not actually hurting for uptime on their defining cooldown in meta, so it's probably a fine loss overall, though I think initially some people were definitely pretty upset. Outside of that, the only other notable addition in this area is a choice node that causes Immolation Aura to remove either a disease or a curse when used, which has the ability to be strong in certain niche situations, so something to watch out for here. The most drastic changes by far happen in the capstone area of the tree, where a lot of stuff has been pulled out here and removed, put into either various spec trees or made baseline like the meta CDR we just touched on. For Vengeance, the stuff moving to the spec tree are Sigil of Spite, Quicken Sigils, and Soul Sigils, but at the same time, you are entirely losing access to both Collective Anguish and the Hunt, which are only going to be available to DPS Demon Hunters, though, if I'm being honest, I found the Hunt to be a bit clunky as a tank player, and I am not personally sad that it's gone. That does mean Aldrachi does need a new activator, though, and we now activate it via Sigil of Spite, which I think makes a lot of sense. In terms of the new talents available here, there's a boost to both generator and spender damage, a boost to fell dev damage when fully channeled, magic DR on successful interrupts, a 6% max health shield when you infernal strike, a chance to generate additional souls, and finally your second charge of demon spikes, which I touched on earlier. So overall, just a lot more passive or modifier choices here compared to before. Moving on to the spec tree, there's been some substantial adjustments here throughout, including a heavy shuffle of positioning, many talents being removed, some new ones being added along with the class tree ones getting moved over. Some talents have remained and been reworked or heavily adjusted as well. We're going to go through the biggest things. I'm probably going to miss a few smaller things, but these are the biggest, most impactful changes. Starting at the beginning of the tree, the reworked Spirit Bomb has moved all the way up to where Frailty was, with Sigil of Spite taking its original position and Frailty moving down to the middle area of the tree. So basically everyone is going to have access to Spirit Bomb with where it is now. Looking at the rest of the tier 1 talents, there are several minor adjustments. Ascending Flame is now just flat 50% damage to all Sigil of Flame damage. Perfectly Balanced Glaive also reduces fracture cooldown by 1 second, and Calcified Spikes is just flat 5% DR instead of a fading 12% DR, so less overall, but again, simpler to use. Other than those, there is a single brand new talent in this area in Fellfire Fist, which is positioned where Meteoric Strikes was, and it causes Infernal Strike to drop a Sigil of Flame on impact when used out of combat or within 5 seconds of entering combat. Well, this is definitely something you'd pass up in raid. It could be interesting in Mythic Plus situations, especially because it's a pretty nice boost to initial threat, which Vengeance has notoriously struggled with in the past, though it does punish you for doing things like chain pulling, and of course, it just won't really be impactful during boss encounters. In my testing, I wasn't a huge fan of this talent, seeing as you were so heavily punished for chain pulling, but it could potentially be good if you're playing with a rogue that is constantly screaming at you about their re-stealth. It also does have some synergy with an optional point in the Annihilator tree, which we'll cover later on. That brings us to the tier 2 talents, where right at the start we've got Feed the Demon now, which has moved up from the capstone area and provides 1 second of cooldown reduction per 20 fury spent instead of 0.35 seconds per soul spent. Overall, this seems to be a bit of a buff when you look at the soul and fury costs of your two spenders, and when combined with the baseline buffs to demon spikes along with the second charge you can pick up in the class tree, it makes it fairly trivial in season 1 to maintain 100% uptime on this defensive ability as long as you are actively hitting some mobs. I'm not sure if that's the goal, but if it is, then it's in a good spot. To use other tanks as an example, it's probably easier to actually maintain demon spikes right now than both Shield of the Righteous for prot paladins and Shield Block for prot warriors, which historically has not always been the case, particularly in the early seasons of an expansion. This area of the tree has also seen a couple reworks to unused defensive talents, with Revel in Pain now granting an absorb for 2% of fire damage done, up to a max of 10% of your HP, similar to Soulmonger, and that maximum does double when Fiery Brand is active. Potentially interesting, but pathing here is a bit of a pain, especially for raid, as you're gated by that new out-of-combat Sigil of Flame node that I discussed earlier to actually get here. The other adjusted node that is more interesting to me is Soul Barrier, which is now a passive tied to Spirit Bomb, causing it to shield you based on soul fragments spent, which potentially has some value if the numbers are right, especially considering the Spirit Bomb cooldown can get quite low with high haste. I think I had it down to like 21 seconds in Season 1 gear during testing. Plus, the Annihilator tree, which we'll discuss later, has some Spirit Bomb resets in there as well, giving this node more value, a real potential option here, whereas before it was just something you kind of ignored. The choice node here has also been changed. Bulk extraction is removed, it's gone, and instead you have the class tree node, Soul Sigils, taking its place, but currently I'm generally leaning towards Soul Barrier. On the topic of sigil-related stuff, though, there's been a significant adjustment to Sigil of Chains, where not only is the cooldown increasing from 1 minute to 1.5 minutes, it now also replaces Sigil of Misery when talented, so you will not be able to have both of them at the same time. This means there's definitely situations where you're better off not talenting into Sigil of Chains in case you want to do things like Misery skips with Shadow Meld, which is a little sad in my opinion, because I was a fan of having both Chains and Misery in your toolkit. I don't feel like the CC kit of Vengeance was so overtuned that they needed to peel back on that, especially as we're seeing several other tank specs gaining CC tools in this expansion, like Blood DK and Prot Warrior. So personally, I would like to see them walk this change back. From there, we can talk about the source of most of the dooming I've seen regarding Vengeance and where they've chosen to reduce the skill ceiling, as I touched on earlier, and that is Frailty. Just like some of the other areas of the spec, we are seeing the baseline power increase, with the duration going up from 6 seconds to 8 seconds, the healing going from 8% damage dealt to 16%, and the applicators being all of Sigil of Flame, Soul Cleave, and Spirit Bomb without additional investment. On top of this, the Void Reaver and Vulnerability talents, which further buff Frailty, have also been increased, with the former going from 3% DR to 4%, and the latter going from 2% damage to 6%. Now, to get through the bad, it starts with Painbringer, which is going to a 6% DR that does not stack from a 2% DR per soul fragment consumed. It not stacking basically just means it's the value of 3 souls at all times, which is relatively low considering how quickly you could consume souls previously, especially when using Spirit Bomb. The second and other substantial nerf here comes to the Soul Crush Capstone, which now just doubles the benefits of Frailty at all times instead of allowing applications to overlap. This means that when you consider all of those baseline benefits going up, you're getting the value of somewhere between 3 and 4 Frailty stacks at all times now, but there's no way to go above and beyond that. I will say I don't think the general goal here is bad. I did personally enjoy the skill expression of Frailty and Painbringer to some degree, but it was also extremely frustrating and punishing at times to need to ramp up your defensiveness. And I think they've done a good job at drastically cutting into that ramp up time. It needs like a global or two, but it's much more in line with other tank specs now, and the baseline defensiveness is a bit up, so it makes sense here that they have to lose something on the top end to compensate. And I think at least with my current testing performance wise, it does seem like an overall improvement in mid-level keys, but it's hard to say what it's going to be like in the highest keys if you're someone pushing for title. We're still not done with the spec changes though, as we haven't touched on the capstone area yet. Luckily, there's not a ton of adjustments here outside of what we've already mentioned, but what has changed is fairly notable. For example, Illuminated Sigils is gone. So Sigil of Flame is down to a single charge, 5-second longer cooldown, and no longer gives parry, so it's basically back to being a purely offensive button. Now, they did adjust Cycle of Binding a bit to compensate for this loss, which instead of giving cooldown reduction when you press Sigil of Flame is now just a flat 15% cooldown reduction to all of your sigils. Outside of this, there's a single new talent where Feed the Demon used to be, called Vengeful Beast, which amps your meta, increasing the duration by 5 seconds, and also boosting the damage of Fracture, Soul Cleave, and Spirit Bomb while in meta by 20%, so a big offensive power boost to your defining cooldown, along with a slight uptime increase. I expect this talent to be a very high pick rate ability, especially because it has a ton of synergy with both the new Annihilator tree as well as the Apex talents, which we can talk about now. For Vengeance, these nodes are called Untethered Rage and revolve around both your spenders as well as meta. The first point here is big value, giving your Soul Cleave and Spirit Bomb a chance to proc Untethered Rage based on fragments consumed, which allows you to cast meta within 10 seconds without incurring its cooldown, though it does last for a shortened 10-second duration. Now, as someone who really dislikes random proc defensives on tanks, this talent does it in a really smart way, giving you a 10-second period to actually activate the proc that you get, so you have some control over when the defensive portion of this effect actually occurs. Big fan of this implementation. The strength here is obviously very high. More meta uptime is always nice, particularly with the loss of Demonic, and the additional power provided by that new Vengeful Beast node just is the cherry on top. Moving on to the 2-point node, Soul Cleave and Soul Bomb have their soul fragment cap increased by 1, so they can now use 3 and 6 souls respectively, and they also get 5% increased damage for each fragment consumed per point, for a total of 10% increased damage per soul when you max this node out. This is a pretty substantial throughput boost, though I found it can sometimes be a bit annoying to try and pool all the way up to 6 fragments to get max value Spirit Bomb, especially when Soul Cleave is also eating up 3 souls per use, so it definitely pushes up the value of souls relative to Fury in your resource economy, so something to keep in mind. For the last point, it adds in some bad luck protection to that initial meta proc, with each failed cast of Soul Cleave and Spirit Bomb giving you a stacking 1% agility buff and increasing your chance to get that meta proc. This buff lasts for 12 seconds and can only be refreshed until you get a proc, which then causes it to reset and then you start again. Overall, these Apex nodes feel very powerful, both offensively and defensively. They feel impactful. Gaining meta obviously feels good, and it drastically increases your meta uptime overall, while also giving you some control over a random proc. And I think it's something a lot of Vengeance Demon Hunter players are going to be happy about, especially when paired with the new hero tree Annihilator, which Vengeance of course shares with the new Devourer Spec. So let's walk through what that is all about, because personally I am a big fan, especially compared to what it replaced in Felsguard. Essentially, this tree revolves around a buff called Voidfall, which Fracture has a 35% chance to grant you 1 stack of. When you reach the cap of 3 stacks, your next Soul Cleave or Spirit Bomb will consume all of them to rain down meteors, with the last one being bigger and also reducing the cooldown of meta by 10 seconds. The stacks also have some passive value, granting you some haste, some damage reduction, and potentially move speed, which all also persist for 8 seconds after you consume your stacks, so you don't need to worry about some weird minigame where you actually want to sit at high stacks to not consume these buffs. You're just safe to use them as you get them. This tree also features several boosts to Spirit Bomb itself, including additional damage against lower target counts, some dot damage, and probably the most interesting of the bunch, a reset of the cooldown when you activate meta, which also now grants you 3 of those Voidfall stacks. This is where the interesting gameplay ramifications come in, because the Apex talent counts as an activation, which adds a lot of depth to players trying to min-max their damage output as an Annihilator, since again, you have that 10-second activation period for the meta proc. So you're trying to make sure that your Spirit Bomb is on cooldown and your Voidfall stacks have recently cleared or just generally as low as possible before activating your meta to bring all those back. As I mentioned earlier, this also has some defensive benefits with the reworked Soul Barrier talent, which was shielding me for about a third of my health pool per 6 soul cast of Spirit Bomb, so pretty impactful if you get frequent casts of this ability. The tree also has a choice node where you can play into the whole Infernal Strike within 5 seconds of combat thing if you want, causing it to also shoot down a single meteor on top of the Sigil of Flame if you're spec'd into Felfire Fist. Again, great for threat, but personally was not a huge fan of the current iteration of this gameplay, so I usually opted to pass on this choice node. Overall, this tree adds some offensive power to meta like the Felsguard tree it replaced, but it feels much less all into that burst window comparatively, which I'm happy about, and I really enjoy the synergies it has and the added rotational depth when you bring in the Apex talents, and it's something that I actually miss when playing Aldrachi. Speaking of, let's switch gears now and talk about the other hero tree, which has 3 new points being added in the expansion, on top of triggering off Sigil of Spite now instead of the Hunt. One of the new points buffs this sigil further, causing it to shatter an additional soul fragment, while also giving Soul Cleave a 20% chance to shatter a fragment. So a higher overall soul economy, which is very nice considering the soul changes I discussed earlier, though I do believe as of right now, the Soul Cleave portion is bugged and doesn't actually shatter fragments ever, so hopefully that gets fixed soon. The last 2 nodes are pieces of the current tier bonus in the War Within, with one increasing your Reaver's Glaive and other physical damage done, and the other increasing Empowered Soul Cleave slashes up to 12 and causing Empowered Fracture to apply an additional stack of Reaver's Mark. Basically, what all this means is Aldrachi is essentially the same as it is currently on live, with the exception of Sigil of Spite being the new activator, which does have advantages in its own right, as the baseline cooldown here is 30 seconds less than the Hunt. Plus, you can reduce it further by an additional 15% if you spec into the reworked cycle of Binding, which means in general a lot more Reaver's Glaive casts over the course of a dungeon or boss encounter. It's also really benefiting from the uncapping of Soul Cleave, just in terms of quality of life, as a big problem for this hero tree specifically was that they didn't really spec into Spirit Bomb, and so AoE threat could be slightly problematic, and this won't fix all those issues, but it certainly helps. Next, I wanted to briefly cover the Season 1 tier bonus, where there isn't a ton to dive into here, as across the board, these seem to be fairly simple and low impact, similar to previous Season 1 bonuses. Both the 2-piece and 4-piece revolve around Fracture, where the 2-piece increases its damage by a flat 30%, and the 4-piece gives Fracture a 30% chance to do an AoE fire hit reduced beyond 5 targets. Now, Fracture has seen several other damage increases going into Midnight, both baseline and via talent in the regular tree or even in the hero trees themselves. And in my testing, the damage contribution with this tier bonus active has actually been pretty substantial overall, somewhere between 8 to 10% overall in a dungeon, which is about double what it is on live. So it's not awful. The 4-piece bonus is also contributing a decent amount, somewhere between 5 and 6% overall in a dungeon. So the numbers, again, they're not crazy, but they're not terrible. A little bit better output, I would say, than the Blood DK tier bonus, but obviously, again, still boring, still not something you're ever going to think about. Finally, let's bring everything together and recap my experience playing the spec in the first few weeks of beta. I will say the vast majority of my time has been spent playing Annihilator. I messed around with Aldrachi for maybe one dungeon, realized it was literally the same, and also that I enjoyed Annihilator gameplay more, so a lot of my opinions are from that context. So to start, let's talk about durability, where, as I touched on earlier, Demon Spikes felt pretty trivial to maintain at full uptime outside of me trying to get used to my new UI and messing it up. So very quickly, it just becomes something that you're not really thinking about much. That being said, it's still not enough on its own in most situations, so it needs to be layered with other things, similar to what Vengeance has done in the past. Historically, one of those things was frailty stuff, so let's talk about that. You can still run into issues with frailty if you don't spread the debuff quickly enough and you get your Painbringer buff up, but the ramp up time is massively decreased over live Vengeance. It's like a global or two tops depending on what the grouping of the pack is, and you can do things like pool resources at the end of pulls to make sure that you are getting those buffs and debuffs rolling global one of the pull. So that is an upside. Another upside is meta uptime, where overall this does appear to be slightly higher than live, despite losing out on demonic thanks to the apex nodes and that spec tree talent, with the midnight version getting around 30%, maybe a little bit more uptime, and live being closer to 25%, maybe a little bit less. Not a massive overall difference here, but still an increase that also brings more overall damage than the live variant. In terms of overall durability, I'd currently label it as middle of the pack in my experience, with both Blood and Prot Warrior feeling a bit stronger in that department currently. It's still up in the air if Blood is going to run into scaling issues in keys, though you could maybe make a similar argument against Vengeance now, with the nerfs to their DR cap from Frailty and Painbringer, potentially making them more vulnerable in those highest level of keys. We'll have to wait and see how everything plays out, because unquestionably, the floor of the spec has been raised a fair bit with their changes. I think intuitively, a lot of the abilities make a lot more sense and are easier to track, right? The DR from Fiery Brand is now tied to yourself. Of course, Frailty is just one singular debuff instead of a stacking thing to keep an eye out. So it's a lot easier to understand, which are good things in my opinion, but I do worry that maybe a bit too much was taken off the top end. It's just hard to say at this point, and it needs a bit more testing before anything definitive can be said. As for the actual gameplay, I am a big fan of them changing Spirit Bomb and uncapping Soul Cleave rotationally. It makes more sense not to have two directly competing abilities. It helps out with threat issues a bit, though Spirit Bomb does feel a bit lacking in the damage department, specifically in single target situations where we're also spec'd into the Focus Cleave talent. So it might be good to have that impact the Spirit Bomb damage output as well, maybe at a lower percentage or something, instead of just Soul Cleave. As I mentioned earlier, Aldrachi is almost identical, but I am a big fan of the hunt being removed for Vengeance. Sorry, not sorry. And especially with the new activator being Sigil of Spite, I think it's only positives. The biggest positive for me, though, is the new Annihilator tree. I really like the Voidfall and Spirit Bomb gameplay with meta resets in combination with talents like the Apex nodes and Soul Barrier. They feel really good to use, really satisfying. They look cool, and they give you some defensive agency over a random proc, which I'm a huge fan of. They also did try something new with the Infernal Strike having the ability to activate meteors and Sigil of Flame if used within 5 seconds of combat. I don't hate this idea, but I'm not a huge fan of the current implementation as I think it's a bit too restrictive. Currently, it's basically useless in raids or against dungeon bosses. Maybe if there was some way to trigger this effect inside of combat as well. For example, I've heard some people suggesting to allow Vengeful Retreat to cause your next Infernal Strike to trigger these effects as well. That could potentially be interesting and not just make them dead talents in those situations. Overall, I'm really enjoying the new stuff Vengeance is getting access to, and I think for the vast majority of players, the buffs to baseline durability and nerfs to frailty will be a net positive. That being said, I am a bit worried about how it'll feel in the highest level of keys. It's possible to be totally fine, it's just hard to say. I would, of course, love to know what you guys think, though. Are you a fan of the changes? What would you like to see adjusted? Let me know down in the comments below. And while you're there, make sure you subscribe for more tank, dungeon, and raid content, which will be ramping up over the next couple months as we get closer to Midnight's launch. As always, I have to shout out all my fantastic Patreons for their continued support, and I'll see everyone in the next video.